Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it a minute so people can get logged in here and join us for this webinar. All right. Sounds like we have a lot of people rolling in. So thanks for joining us. I'm Jeanette Brown. I'm the Senior Director of Public Affairs at SCAMP. We're very pleased to present the next workshop in our Asset and Property Management Workshop Series. This is the fifth one we've done this year, and we'll continue it again next year. But we're very pleased to have Courtney Richard, who is the Vice President of Property Management at National Core, and her colleague AJ Galka, the Director of Permanent Supportive Housing and Resident Services at National Core as well. The session's really focused on property management and supportive services working hand in hand. And thank you so much to AJ and Courtney for joining us today. And I know they have a great program for you, so I'm going to pass it on over to them.
Awesome, thank you. So I will go ahead and kick it off, and just want to say thank you to everyone that has tuned in to hear us speak. So let's get into it. AJ, next slide. Thank you. So I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with National Core, but if you are not, National Community Renaissance, we're a nonprofit community development corporation. We're dedicated to definitely breaking the cycle of generational poverty by implementing programs that empower individuals and change communities. And definitely one thing that we go by is it's a launching pad, not a landing pad. Okay, next slide, AJ. So we were founded in 1992. Right now we have over 400 employees, and we are hiring, guys. So check out our website if you're interested. We have a total of 10,000 units right now, which will continue to grow next years. We have over 13 projects currently under construction, or they will be actually beginning construction soon. We have over 30,000 residents. We are the nation's fourth largest nonprofit affordable housing developer. And we like to think of ourselves as being the one-stop shop. So we have an acquisitions department, planning and development, a construction department, property management, compliance, asset management, and social services. So next slide.
Thanks, Courtney. So transition into supportive housing, we have within that portfolio that Courtney just mentioned, we have about 556 units, 19 sites of vulnerable population supportive housing units that are currently leased up or currently in the lease up process. We have over 600 units, 20 sites of vulnerable populations, supportive housing units in the pipeline. Note that this is a point in time capture. So literally week by week, it's changing when things jump into construction. Funding gets secured and things move, but this is a nice estimate. So we're looking, close to increasing over the thousands over the next 3 to 5 years. And I'm AJ Galka from Hope Through Housing. So Hope Through Housing is a sister nonprofit from the larger nonprofit National Core Courtney just described. It was established in 1992. It has almost 9,000 units that they provide services and residential service coordination on site. The sites include anywhere from San Diego, Los Angeles, Inland Empire, Riverside, and San Bernardino included, Orange County. And we also have 5+, meaning somewhere in the works for Texas. And one of the things that we really strive to do is looking at how we provide services, gaining feedback, sustainability, cost savings across the board, and really supporting property management through and through with all residents at the sites that Hope Through Housing serves. And today we'll cover understanding competing objectives between property management and social services, our united mindset approach, clarity in roles and responsibilities, key tips, pathways for communication. Housing retention is definitely a shared core objective, no pun intended for core. Early prevention approaches and real life examples. But to kick us off, Courtney and I thought it'd be a great idea to ask you guys a question in the chat. So from your own personal experience as being a human being in this world, existing, having to create a safe space for yourself. What do you do, or what do you need to do to feel stable in your life? What must exist? So you wouldn't mind just putting your answer in the chat so we can see it. Housing, income, employment, my health, family, housing, a good night's sleep, yes, for sure. Security, health, employment, peaceful existence. No dogs, no happiness. I agree on that one. I agree. Housing, income, downtime, good paying job, faith, stability, cash flow. So a lot of key themes happening there to create security and being a human being and just purely existing. So the next slide just highlights the social determinants of health. Basically, all the things that collectively equate to having stability in a person's life, all of us, whether you're referred into a PSH unit, vulnerable population or not, we all need these key things. So these include education access and quality, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood built an environment, meaning you have connections to your neighborhood, you have your local shops, your pharmacies, your healthcare, your schools and education access. You have economic stability, people mentioned jobs, social community contacts, meaning they have a community within a community, whether it be in their building or a local senior center or a local church. They have that existence and those key pillars across their life to have that general human stability. And obviously we heighten it when we have folks with multiple challenges.
All righty, guys. So my name is Courtney Richard. I am the Vice President of Relocation and Property Management. I have been in property management for a while, started in the conventional world, wanted to try something new, and ended up in the affordable world. So as you guys probably already know, a lot of new affordable housing that's coming online incorporates permanent supportive housing. And if you've been in the industry for a while like me, you will understand it's been a huge adjustment for us. And so that's what we will be going over today. So just competing objectives. Next slide.
So like Courtney was saying about the competing objectives, obviously property management has assets to manage, and so services have to support the person that they're serving. The mindset of our approach is inclusive of trauma-informed, being nimble, harm reduction, being cultural competence, collaborative, balance between the PM objective and that natural tension that exists, and then also that retention focus. The trick with that is there's a necessary thing that needs to exist within any organization or partnership is ensuring that there's enough tools in the toolkit that everybody has kind of a baseline understanding, baseline objective. There's data that people can reflect on, whether it be resident surveys or things like that, which we'll get into farther on down the road, but infrastructure as well to support doing the right thing, following a process, which Courtney will share pieces of that process throughout. But a key component of this, when I talked about baseline, is professional development, meaning everybody from facilities, property management from Courtney's team, facilities from Courtney's team, social services, external partners, all of us, even asset management, being pulled into trainings like this. So they really understand kind of the core objectives of serving vulnerable populations. They understand the level of intensity sometimes it is. They understand the root causes of homelessness, the main and core concepts of permanent supportive housing, mental health 101. There's some great trainings out there from NAMI and across the board, CSH, NAMI, you name it. There's fabulous trainings out there. For us, we end up doing an in-house training bootcamp style, so 2-day format where everybody attends. Either we have a virtual session or in person. We cover all these core topics shown on the slide. And the idea is whether you're facilities, property management, social services teams from HOPE or CORE, collectively, we have that same baseline knowledge, so we're approaching it with those lenses. It includes diversity, equity, inclusion, self-reflection on bias, implicit bias. We do have a clinician come in for half a day and literally pull up real cases from our properties. So Courtney captured some great photos of a unit that was completely destroyed, hoarding, unaccompanied guests, et cetera, just examples that we could see internally and process them and see what is the best way to approach them.
And so we definitely needed to get training out there just because, again, it was new. In 2016, we had to implement housing first on our sites that had permanent supportive housing. And I know a lot of people on site at the time that actually had units, PSH residents, were a little lost. And so at that time, us as an organization, we got together. There was a lot of brainstorming, a lot of meetings, very long meetings, where we were trying to figure this out and trying to implement this and change our policies and procedures. And along the way, someone had an amazing and a bright idea to bring AJ on board. And I will say she came onto the team and hit the ground running. And the first thing we knew we had to work on and implement on our sites was training. And so that's how the training came about, and it's been a huge success. So when first starting out on a lease up that includes PSH units, definitely the first step and one of the most important steps, you guys, is the clarity on roles and responsibilities. It is definitely key. I've worked on 2 projects where we implemented this right away, and it was a huge success. And I've worked on a project where this was not implemented. Lines were blurred. There was a lot of finger pointing, a lot of disagreements because each party was expecting the other one to be completing a task and really didn't understand what the roles were of each other. And so I would say right away, you need to schedule a sit down to map out each party's core roles and responsibilities. So right off the bat, we put together like a 2-hour call, and there's actually a sheet that we'll get to next where everyone goes through and we define roles and responsibilities. So at any time, when those lines are blurred and you need to revisit them, you have a sheet to actually go through. And so let's just say a situation pops up and you're like, oh, should I handle that? Or should the service provider handle that? You have that sheet as a tool. It's definitely helped us. And so definitely we don't mind sharing. So next slide, AJ.
So this one is exactly what Courtney was talking about, how we mapped out the roles and responsibilities. I think one thing I think Courtney, you and I can agree on is sometimes these have to be revisited a lot. People, like different personality types, work in different roles. You have some people that like to do everything, like on the property management side or the social service side. So really kind of coaching and working with folks. I know Courtney and I have had to jump in on certain sites just to say, hey, this is more services, keep that weight off your shoulders. And we've gone back a few times, and sometimes it's just an ongoing process to revisit this. But exactly like Courtney said, this tool here really allows it to be put down on paper. Some of them are joint roles. So like even move-in, sometimes property management will put together part of the kit, and then social services will pick up the rest of the kit. And there might even be like 2-3 other partnerships like behavioral health on site, and they'll chip in another portion. So some of those things will vary by site. But overall, it's fairly clear of, notices, events, things like that. There are some bonuses on working together really closely with property management. And I know Courtney could probably share more, but just the budget, we're able to kind of leverage property management budget with on-site coordination budget to facilitate fun events and other things like that.
Yes. No, and thank you, AJ, for that, because I think in the property management world, we hop in and we want to fix everything. I think it's just our nature. And so, having those roles and responsibilities written down, I think it helps guide us also to where, okay, there is somebody else that can hop in and take care of that for me. So if you guys have worked with me, if you work with me right now, I really reiterate this constantly. Communication is key. Definitely in all aspects of our life, but it's definitely key when working on a site that has PSH units, because the communication between property management and the service provider, it has to be constant. You almost want to over communicate. So what we like to do is we start off with weekly check-ins. And so during those check-ins, and it can just be at the site level at that time where everyone, boots on the ground, you guys are meeting and going over issues and collaborating. At all points, the service provider should know when property management is going to be serving a resident with a letter. That way they can actually help assist you with that letter. And so, or those notices, I should say. And so, if there's any behavioral issues, unfortunately, we do run into times where we do have to send a resident to eviction. Your service provider should be a part of that process. And so monthly all hands on deck meetings, usually our monthly meetings are a little higher up. And so that's when usually your leaders from each organization, they're on the calls, boots on the ground, everyone's on the call just to see how the property's doing, see how we can collaborate. I feel as though in this business, there's always room for improvements, room for new ideas. So these monthly all hand on deck meetings, they're definitely important. At that time, let's just say you have vacancies. You want to go over your referrals that you should be receiving, where you are in the process. And so monthly all hand on deck meetings, they're typically scheduled once we're fully leased up, not so much when you're going through the lease up process. But when you're going through the lease up process, those weekly check-in meetings are important. And again, touching on the referrals also. On-site team should check in with the service provider frequently. Honestly, for us, a lot of our new properties coming on board, we actually have our service providers on site with us. And so we push the teams to, in the morning, take a few minutes out of your day just to go check in with your service provider. Sometimes they'll know of an incident before you do. And so it's great for you guys to have that communication and check in all the time. And I don't think anyone would have an issue with over communicating. And so sub meetings scheduled to focus on retention, empowerment, and intervention. Needs unique to each resident. So as we know, each resident is not going to be the same. And so sometimes having those individual one-on-ones to come up with a plan, it's definitely needed. So communicate, guys. That's how I feel as though we've been so successful on some of our sites. It's just communicating with our service providers and all partners that are involved. Next slide. So property management perspective. So I know I touched on this in the beginning, but I'm gonna touch on it again. It definitely, it's an adjustment for us because, you violate your lease, you get a, lease violation. If it's bad enough, we send you to eviction, and that's about it. And so definitely having permanent supportive housing units has changed that process. And so from the property management standpoint, one thing that definitely I feel as though we had to kind of have a sit down about, and not too many people were happy. It was definitely when it came to screening. Just because, for us, we use Yardi. You insert a resident into Yardi, it's either they're approved or not. And, sometimes you will escalate it for a second review, but pretty much it. So implementing housing first, we definitely had to change our screening criteria. Couldn't hold, financial or anything credit related against our new residents. And, once you take a step back, and I guess you look at the overall picture about housing retention and, providing for housing for individuals that just want a new start, you start to look at it in a different light. And so one thing that we also had to do, and I know we're probably all guilty of it, is we know our property management role, and we really didn't step out the box too much to really understand the service provider's role. And I will say that's something that we had to change, because we need to understand what they do, how they do it, how it impacts our residents, and how we can support them in their role. And so that was a change. And also just housing retention, just, you know, the main focus is wanting to keep people housed. I mean, in affordable housing, and just in any housing, we definitely, you know, we hope that our residents pay on time. We hope our residents behave. And so, but if they don't, it's okay. We're going to go ahead and, you know, serve you and send you to legal. So with having PSH residents, there's the steps are a bit different because you need to meet with your service provider. Sometimes we'll come up with a housing retention plan to where we say, okay, you did commit this lease violation, but you know, here are the steps that we're going to take to help you get back on track. And so wasn't used to that. Definitely a change. And also just reviewing our policies and procedures. So when it comes to the new developments, and there's a lot of documentation that's happening behind the scenes before we actually even open up the new property. You have your tenant selection plans being created, your management plans. And so, you know, we complete them, we send them over to the agency, and we're like, okay, we know, slam dunk, they'll be approved. And so once we actually had to implement housing first on the sites, we were getting corrections back like, nope, this needs to be under housing first. You need to, you know, amend this. And we were like, okay, this is new. And so, so definitely that was a mindset change also. And so when it comes to evictions and your lease violations, again, mindset changes. So, you know, guys, for me, it was just taking a look and just saying, okay, how can I help them? And so, and I think that's what helped guide me with being able to adapt to these changes a lot quicker than most. And so also using an expanded toolkit of approaches. So motivational interviewing, I actually just used this a few weeks ago, understanding harm reduction. And so we'll get into some of these tools a little later on, but definitely, guys, it's just about changing your mindset. If you're just new to the property management world, it may be a bit easier because you're learning the business with the PSH, PSH and Housing First already implemented. And so, but for some of us have been in the business for a while, it definitely, it's been a struggle. So next slide. So shared objective, retention. So again, housing retention is key. So early on and during the lease up phase or just your new move in, one thing that we do is we reach out to the case manager and we invite them to actually join in during lease signing. And also whenever they're completing our, you know, the waitlist applicant, or not the waitlist application, but a lot of our documents that have to go to compliance, so our application packets. And so we actually try to really push, almost make it mandatory that they are there, just because it's the sense of trust that the resident has already built with them. And so it makes our process a lot easier to where we're not receiving as much pushback when asking for documents. And so during those initial meetings, you definitely want to work in conjunction with the case manager to set up expectations and clarity of processes early on for the residents and the providers. So a lot of times I will give the case managers a blank lease. And I'm like, hey, you really should know, you know, our policies and procedures just the same as your client. And so we'll get into this a little later on, the early prevention process. There are some steps and some documents that we use, and then also the housing stability plan. But you guys will see having the case manager involved and actually going over these processes and expectations early on, you tend to see a lot more success. Now, I do want to tell you guys, I mean, you know, we don't live in a perfect world. And so sometimes even with taking all the necessary steps, we do still end up, you know, having some issues and having evictions. But I will say having these steps put in place, it has helped reduce those numbers. Okay, next slide. And I will throw it to AJ.
Thanks. Literally everything that we do is like together. So lease ups, Courtney and I work together. Service planning, tenant selection, all of that we work together. I've learned so much from Courtney since my time at National Core and Hope Through Housing. So definitely know that unity with your property management is so imperative to how things shape out and how things work forward and how things are for the actual consumer, our residents. So know that the content I'm going to cover in here is like a little slice off the top, and each of these topics or pieces could have its own training, which we're glad to come back at any time. So just know they're little tastes, and I'm sure you have lots of questions. So please put them in the Q&A. So really quick recap, what is permanent supportive housing, in case anybody does not know on here? Essentially housing for folks that are very vulnerable, that have experienced homelessness, that have a disability, that need those supportive services to remain housed indefinitely. Some folks can graduate off, but most folks that we've seen typically stay on because they need that long-term support and that long-term subsidy. So it's affordable and secure, and they have supports when they go into crisis or other things happen. The key elements are affordability, safety, comfort, supportive services that are accessible, flexible, and target residential stability, empowerment, and independence, meaning no one's conserved. We shapeshift on the services end to meet the needs of our residents. So if someone's used to sleeping all day long and up all night, we'll have to figure out how we can connect with them, to sit down and work out a plan, to connect with them for resources and services and things like that during acclimation periods, 6, 12, sometimes even 24 months. No, I also put the link to CSH's full list for the key elements or key principles of PSH below. So when you get the slides, you guys can click on the full document. So just a perspective, and Courtney and I use this a lot working with property managers, even on the development side of what people's expectations are. Folks often move from a chronic homeless situation where they're in encampments, and it's survival, and it's their home at that point in time, and it's the way that they live. And so having to transition into the image on the right, I don't think my living room actually even looks like this either, is nearly impossible. So having really realistic expectations for service side and property management is essential, just to start off right off the bat. Because when they start doing inspections and coming into units, the reality is everybody has judgment, and everybody makes judgment across everything they see. So if they have this image on the right in their head, and that's what we expect for everybody, a lot of people aren't going to do so well, including me. So just have that in the back of your mind, setting that realistic perspective and incorporating images like this into training, very contrast images, but allow people to kind of see that difference. And maybe it's kind of somewhere in the middle where that folks will be at. And also, I think I can't really see the chat, so forgive us, we'll do Q&A at the end again. But on the left, a lot of folks, build community, and the folks that they have out on the streets are their support system, who keep them safe, who watch their cart if they're going to go use the showers, if they're going to apply for housing, if they're going to get new IDs, so they can apply for housing, or get medication or go to a doctor's appointment. So these folks are like family. So it's very hard. I know that there's a lot of issues across the board with developments and PSH units for unauthorized guests, and that's something we will touch on in a little bit. But I mean, just recognize the fact of being a human being and being in a vulnerable situation, you create connections to build that support. And so to expect someone to completely sever is not necessarily realistic. So coming up with really realistic solutions. One that we found in the past, working with a community research foundation, I believe it was Senior Impact Adelante, Rhonda Gibbs, who's the head of their housing, had just an amazing approach where she really focused on intensive services on their guests. Who perhaps needed the same thing to get into court and entry system, to access services and help them get housing. Because oftentimes that was the root cause. And it was more of a graceful way to intervene and a graceful way to support everybody who's involved. And oftentimes it did work. The next piece is just a very simplistic elementary visualization of how it works. But essentially the person in the middle is the vulnerable resident, or any resident really. Because even general populations have vulnerable moments, have health crisis, have mental health crisis, financial and so forth. Like we mentioned before, what we need to be stable, things happen and we become unstable. But all of these folks around here support that resident. So you'll see property management on the left. You'll see the resident obviously in the center. Below could be family, outside entities, rep payees, in-home service providers. On the right could be an external contracted provider, like I mentioned, CRF through behavioral health, has a couple of programs at one of our sites, and we work very closely with them. We have case conferencing regularly. We work closely with property management. And then on top is the sister nonprofit to National Core that I mentioned before, Hope Through Housing, that does on-site residential service coordination. So oftentimes when the service provider in the purple here, the external partner is not on site 24/7 unless they have a large quantity of units. If you have a building with 8 units or maybe 20% of the units, they might be on there maybe a portion of their time. They might rotate across sites. So this on-site residential coordinator, whoever it may be, is really essential to kind of keep that going, that connectivity, those eyes, those ears, adapt services and programming to support the needs of the population, but kind of is that bridge when that external provider is off-site and they're the lead case manager for a particular resident, or a few or more. The little bubbles on, or rather clouds on the right, is basically ensuring upon developing the property to begin with, we often get in the haste of getting it funded and all that excitement. We want it to become real and have a ribbon cutting, is making sure we have the right dose of services to the population, or even the equation or a mix of populations, making sure how that looks. So really having a hard look, doing research, looking at patterns in other properties. Like for us, we have a large portfolio, so we're able to look across sites and see what are the common costs that we're seeing, what are the common issues, incident reports across a large portfolio. And that's extremely helpful. I know the hot topic right now is, do you add parking to PSH? Because some folks might not, or seniors with parking. There's often hot topics like that that are really good to do research before making assumptions. But number one rule is at the very beginning, or even let's say you're in the middle of it, you jumped into a project, is really looking at it. Maybe the incidences are high because the dosage of services is too low. So having that hard look on it. And then the other one to the left is ensuring Core and Hope have a well-trained team. Like I talked about early on, that's everything. If everybody has that baseline knowledge of maybe the history of homelessness, they have more empathy, they understand permanent supportive housing, the objectives, they truly understand motivational interviewing, harm reduction, their own bias, they have their own self-reflective piece of this, that helps consistency across the services side, the external services side, and then Courtney's teams. Courtney, did you want to add anything to that?
I do. The one thing that really helped us, and I honestly believe it helps the on-site teams, is taking, there's different classes that you can take that can go over the different signs of mental illness, the different stages. And for us, it's been helpful to know, okay, this resident is showing this type of behavior. Let me go ahead and have a conversation with the service provider. And so, or, let me call the PERT team. And so during those trainings, they go over just so much and just give you the tools to where on the property management side, we're able to help our service providers with looking out for behaviors that could unfortunately escalate to the next level. So just want to throw that in there.
I think also, Courtney, even just thinking about when we have inspections at sites, one of the things I feel like facilities, when they go through and like either they're like checking all the smoke detectors, things like that, they're able to capture quick glimpses of units to see if there's anything that folks need more time to work on. So we know hoarding is more of a clinical thing. So how do we help catch it early on or have interventions? So on the property management side, all units pass, it's less stress. People have time to lead time to actually work on it.
Correct. And I hope guys, so whenever we speak about training, we are talking about all positions. So not just the manager, not just your leasing consultant, not just your AM, you need to involve your maintenance team also, because they're the front line, they're the ones going into the units. And so they need the training also. So, so thank you, AJ, for that. So appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you. Right back. Okay, so next we implemented this with our actual residential coordinators. So again, the sister nonprofit that works very closely with National Core, because we do them with external partners. We have them across the board, like CSH hosts the No Place Like Home or behavioral health coordination calls and crosswalks, which is fabulous. But we needed some internal, even for some that are not necessarily identified as PSH referred units. Essentially, they're just really helpful. We can catch folks that are experiencing early onset dementia, cases of early hoarding activities, things like that. So we implemented case conferencing with PSH support teams. We have a lot of MSW interns, DSW interns, as well as we just hired on the National Core and Hope side to have retention specialists. So over the last year, we hired Vanessa, who oversees the upper umbrella of counties. And we just hired through COC HUD funding a retention specialist, Nina, who just came on board this week. She is going to be managing all of San Diego. So for that, they lead case conferencing. They can meet with the general residential service coordinators that are at sites that might be leading activities for social reasons, food pickup, holiday events, things like that. And they have the ability to have the eyes and ears as well, just like Freddie mentioned, facilities, property management, everybody collectively, security, all of us have eyes and ears. But in this respect, they can bring forth any type of concerns, do a phone consultation with the specialist and say, is this something that we should bring to case conferencing? I'm kind of worried about this one resident. And we're able to have a sit down and dive into the case and say, here's some tools maybe to connect them with. And at times it is calling APS to link them back into care or link them into services or linking to PACE or other programs that are more intensive or behavioral health. But it really allows that space to, one, empower our residential coordinators to have those tools in their toolkit to start to identify things they're experiencing and being trained, or knowing when to call APS, or knowing that they can call APS. It's not always a bad thing, it could be a helpful thing. But these also allow that greater discussion of being solution focused, so that residential service coordinator can feel empowered on seeing kind of the end goal, the retention piece, even beyond just the day-to-day activities that are happening on site that they manage. Same with even property management. Property management can bring forth cases to the retention specialist or to myself, and we can sit down and kind of review it and then bring it into case conferencing. Some example cases on some, actually we're seeing a lot of this across our sites, is a lot of aging in place where folks with early onset dementia, medications mixing, so it presents like that. So really having connectivity with certain services for certain counties or regions when you start to see patterns. So this is also tracking those patterns. So we can link up with those providers that can really help kind of intervene as needed. Because we might see 80% of our aging in place calls or case conferencing cases in San Diego. So we're going to invest more time into building those relationships so we have a nice clear referral pathway to those entities that provide that care. But each of them present their cases. They talk about updates. They can essentially establish some key objectives that they're going to be doing. It could be linked back with APS, see the progress made with linking up with the provider, and so forth. But this piece could, again, be a whole training within itself, so I won't go any further. But it's definitely imperative across each region, whether it's property management side or the services side. And note, this again is on top of the case conferencing that occurs with the external partners. Because some folks are not necessarily PSH referred, they might be general affordable. And again, we're human, we all have kind of the same issues that pop up, and this allows for that space to collectively address any vulnerable population at any given time. Did you want to add anything, Courtney?
No, you hit on everything. Thank you.
So this one, both Courtney and I mapped this out actually for another training we did in unaccompanied guests. So you'll see the language in here. Essentially, it talks about unaccompanied guests, but essentially it talks about the notice going to the property management, the communication also going to the service provider, like Courtney previously mentioned. The red essentially is saying, this intervention hits faster. We want it to be a swifter intervention where services get involved immediately because they can jump in right away. They can have a sit down and work through a tool, which we'll show in the next slide, and really start to dive in and explore like what things can be mitigated. Sometimes things can't. So it's having those hard conversations too, like Courtney mentioned, sometimes maybe transferring to a different location. Maybe the site is not conducive. It could be triggering because of the location. So having those hard conversations and really looking at the root causes of the violation. But you'll see in this thing, I'm not going to go square by square or rectangle by rectangle, but you'll see essentially it's noted as a violation. Someone notes it. An investigation could happen like during annual repairs, inspections or unit repairs in general. A resident is in violation for an unaccompanied guest in this case. That was our example for this. For residents working with a coordinated provider on site, notice is also shared with them because then they can coordinate together. A meeting occurs, they schedule a meeting with the resident to review the violation. Oftentimes provide services, like we talked about how Sierra provided services to that other guest of a resident, so they could work towards getting their own housing and exiting the unit that they're occupying and potentially risking their friend or family member's housing, helping them get that access. And then working with the resident to shape a realistic step to remedy it. And sometimes it takes multiple tries. It's not instant. And that's where Courtney was mentioning earlier. It's sometimes really frustrating for property management side because they're like about filing paperwork on time, asset management. And now they're having to kind of like create this like gray area or flexibility, which I know Courtney, you know, sometimes can breed frustration, but it's imperative to help folks that need a little bit more tender loving care and support. And then monitoring check-ins, meaning just because we solve it the first time doesn't mean it won't come back. So really having that mindset across property management facilities, you know, just because a unit might get cleaned out or treated for bed bugs or whatever it may be, or unaccompanied guest, another one returns, another guest comes, knowing that that's reality. And having a realistic standpoint as you're working together, that is the reality. So how do we work with it? Not have this tension against it. And ideally this ends in retention because that's what we ultimately want with our residents. But again, like Courtney said, sometimes we try, and in some cases eviction or going to a different site might be more appropriate. For this one is the early prevention approaches that Courtney came to that earlier. But essentially, like she mentioned, the service provider presents at the lease up. So we had a lease up recently in Cathedral City for Cathedral Palms. And we had not only property management do their typical orientation and spiel, the housing authority. We also had our on-site service coordinator give their spiel and had a little folder with all their information. We also had Riverside Health, behavioral health, have case managers there and also kind of give their orientation as they walk the residents to their units after the orientation and be with them during that lease up process. Because that's key. Honestly, if you set someone up with not really knowing what they're getting into, not really understanding those lease rules like Courtney, you know, mentioned, like it's setting up someone for failure. So really understanding that even before they sign that application, that they really understand the rules of living in housing, understanding, you know, the expectations of being a good neighbor. And we know that that's a work in progress, but really as like a gift to someone coming into a new space, you know, allowing them that knowledge as they're filling out the paperwork, as they're reviewing the lease, and making sure to get a copy of that lease for maybe not only themselves, but a lot of service providers appreciate it, like Courtney said, because then they understand how they can support that resident. They might see, you know, I know, you know, my clientele is, you know, really loud at 3 a.m. and that's going to be an issue. They already know. So they can start to work ahead and create that mitigation plan to intervene in advance or kind of coaching, because we all have something we do. Ongoing community and resident communication. We have sites across the board that do great newsletters that kind of shape shift their residential service programming based on incidences, security issues. They have town halls if there's major issues repeating themselves. I know at Veterans Park, we have a town hall coming up, I believe it's this week or next. So we're really able to kind of pull in and look at the data, like I mentioned earlier, look at the data and have it guide that process. So you're not just spinning your wheels to spin your wheels. It's actually, you know, very intentional. Like Courtney mentioned, regular PM and service check-ins, communication, like she said, communication. On-site intensive case management, having the coordination on site, the retention tools. One of the things I think oftentimes is missed is you have these amazing providers working with clientele and they know kind of the key elements of struggle, the key areas that might be a challenge in a housing setting, whether it be being closed up in a unit with walls and it feels containing, they might get isolated, depressed, or more symptomatic, whatever it may be. They kind of know the precursors could be there. And having that ability to kind of plan, prepare, mentally help the clientele or resident adjust and kind of envision what it will be like, developing tools like RAP plans, wellness recovery action plans for if they go into crisis, they have tools that they can access. And then even post, obviously we know as people transition or as even you or I or anybody who've been to anywhere, You're adapting to the weird noises, the smells, the changes, the neighbors. We might not like all of our neighbors. That happens too for all of us. So just, knowing that there'll be ongoing kind of intervention, just being, a human being. The image to the right is an example of a collaborative housing retention plan. Many entities have this. I know Behavioral Health has one. I know Wakeland has one. I believe Affirmed, Chelsea, I think they all have their own version. This is ours. But essentially, it's a two-part process adapted from some of theirs, and collectively we share all of ours as developers. It's very helpful, and service providers. But essentially, the first part, the property manager is involved for that meeting. And again, this can be a whole training within itself. And they sit down and discuss the violation in front of the resident and the service provider. Very transparent, discussing what happened, discussing the exact part of the lease that was violated. Everybody agrees that they'll try to work on mitigating it. Sometimes they don't. That's reality too. The second half is the property management steps out. And that's where folks can get more into the clinical details, the personal details, and work through all of that stuff. And really devise a realistic plan for that resident to keep their housing and try to mitigate that behavior, whether it be unauthorized guests, whether it be smoking in their unit, whatever it may be. We definitely hope that these help. And again, to reiterate what Courtney said, like 10 times in her section, documentation is key, and communication is everything. Because at the end of the day, you want to document your efforts, your work, your attempts, everything you've tried to do, the timelines, and then communication as a whole.
Mhm.
And then housing stability plan, this again could be its own training. But having that plan, knowing folks have, like each of us have our weaknesses, whether we're really loud on our phone when we're talking, or we work from home, or we tend to walk loud with high heels in our apartments, whatever it may be. Having something like this set up, and I pulled up an example from LASA, because I like the setup of it. Other people have their own forms of it that you can adapt to. I put the link to this example, so all of you guys can see it on your own time. But essentially, it focuses on HUD's objectives. So obviously, maintaining your housing, the retention piece, obtaining, maintaining income or benefits of some sort, self-determination goal, whatever that may be. But it helps map that out. So as a resident flows into their unit, they have kind of like a little reference guide to look back at. They also have something to celebrate those small wins or big wins, as maybe they're at the 6-month mark or even 1 month mark. And they can see like, wow, I've maintained my housing. Like it wasn't so bad. I don't feel so isolated anymore. Or maybe I did A, B, C, D to help mitigate that. And these tools really help as long as you're using them in an interactive way where it's very client-centric and led by them. But these are definitely a great personal thing. Any of us could do them in our regular life and regular everyday life, not professional. I guess you could do it professional. But it can help guide you through certain areas of growth and really help set the tone and help, again, have a reflection for wins. And then just a quick recap, identifying the barriers to retaining housing and steps to mitigate or resolve them, do it in advance. Like if your service provider is already working with them, they're already connected with them, that's such a blessing because they already know the history, they already know patterns, they already know potential challenges. So really looking at those, with a hard lens and saying like, how do we make this person succeed? How do we give them every tool we possibly can think of and try our best to help them, get through this. So trying those tools perhaps helps for some. Client strengths, really identifying those strengths. Like they might have, an amazing relative that checks in on them, brings them, groceries once a week, whatever it may be. Or they have just amazing personality and they love going to the library and that's their social outlet and, whatever, again, it may be. But finding those strengths in each person that we're working with to really build upon them and steps that are needed to build upon those strengths to make sure that they succeed in housing. Available resources, again, toolkit, helping your staff, your team, even your residents, everybody just build their toolkit with resources on themselves, on access of resources, obtaining pathways to those resources. There's so many times, I'm sure Courtney can attest to this as well, through property management, whether it's arrears payments, like programs, food programs, sometimes the pathway is definitely unclear for our residents. And so if we can even bring the services on site to mitigate that issue, or having someone come on site to train folks, or a very clear handout, something that helps create a very clear light down that pathway to get to those resources is everything. So you could have 50,000 resources, but if you only know how to get to 2 of them, what's the point? The last one is schedule consistent home visits for the service provider for if they're doing intensive case management, making sure it's on the regular so people can expect that consistency. especially during that 6 to 12 months during that acclimation at minimum. That's the hardest part. If you're used to living with a community, an encampment, and then you're moving to a box with a couple windows with somewhat fresh airflow, it's not ideal. Like anyone would get depressed and isolated. You can't have your friends there because you get violations. You just, just planning ahead for that. Even our seniors moving into their units, it's lonely. Like they get comfortable, they finally have a space to rest, but it's also really lonely. So ensuring that you have the activities to help get them out of their units or bring stuff to their units. But those visits are everything, or connecting with PACE or IHSS.
And so AJ, I want to hop in for a second, especially on the property management side. So sometimes, guys, a lot of us, we go into the units for annual inspections. And so, but your service provider is placing eyes on the units a lot more. And so that's where that communication piece comes into play, because they can inform you guys if there, are any housekeeping issues, if there's any damages in the units ahead of time. That way, when you schedule those annual inspection walks, it's no surprise. And then you've already more than likely, and you should have rectified the issue when the service provider has informed you guys. And so when it comes to your lease, I really want to hone in on this. So more than likely, your lease has been approved by a few agencies that are making sure that that you're following Housing First guidelines. And so when it comes to the visitor policies, when it comes to your housekeeping, you are able to still follow what's in your lease. Because more than likely, if there was an issue to where the lease was too strict, it was in violation of Housing First, it would have been kicked back in the early stages of the development process. So please make sure that you guys are still going off of your lease. So many times I get calls and it's, hey, Courtney, the resident has had a guest over for 2 days. Should I go ahead and send a notice? Should I go ahead and get with the service provider? And my reply is, what does your lease say? What are your lease guidelines when it comes to, your visitor policies? And so just make sure, guys, that you're not, creating judgment just because of the population and we're not adhering to the lease, because it can go both ways. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
That's such a good point, because we saw that early on, and that's why we implemented so many trainings, like years of trainings, because that happens sometimes. Like, if you're leasing up a building, it's general affordable, and then we have some PSH referred units. You see this division. So you're right, really working on that, creating that blended approach across the board, because no one should be treated differently in that sense. Obviously, they have the additional supports, but everything else on the front end is the same. It's equal.
Correct.
So we wanted to pull up some examples. So Courtney and I worked on some 3 examples. Are we good on time, guys? Jeanette, Ariana?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. So we wanted to pull up a couple examples just to show you the success of having services and property management work together. So we're going to pull up 3. We might not get through all because it looks like there's a lot of questions. Courtney, do you think we should keep it to 2?
Yeah, 2 is great.
So the first one, we'll call him Mr. G. We covered up the space for privacy, but very, very amazing individual. He's going through aging needs. He lost his spouse. He had housekeeping issues just from isolation, depression, just upkeeping. Past bed bugs started to accumulate. Engagement was really hard. He wanted to avoid folks. He had a set circle of people he wanted to connect with. Neighbors were all supportive of him. Medical needs, meaning nutrition, other things like that. Actions we had to execute as a team, meaning not just services. It was services, property management, on-site residential services, as well as an external provider. Also linking in other services like IHSS and other things that we layered in. But we cleared out infested unit from clutter. And again, this was a collective effort, meaning the services side by side with property management and Courtney's team. Treated for bed bugs and pests, replaced broken appliances, worked with local nonprofit for new furniture, new mattress, create a healthy environment, framed his award-winning albums, ensured his late wife's items were protected, honored his history and built his self-esteem. He went through a very dark period, like any of us would if we lost our loved one. And we were able to help kind of go through the stressful mode of cleaning stuff out and working with him and processing this stuff collectively. Again, property management services working together and really pull some really sweet things in that made him feel so much joy, and bring in new furniture, establish coordination pathways with external providers as the lead. Working with that provider was phenomenal. They helped linked up with IHSS, establish connections to meal programs, food delivery to ensure he had nutritious meals, prevention needs. I mean, we did all this work. We have a great looking unit, got it to baseline, for a habitable unit that would pass inspection. And then prevention needs. I mean, it doesn't stop. Regular check-ins with residents. It could be like a knock on the door, like this picture here with some supplies, sometimes dropping off some supplies if we have them donated to the services side or property management, stopping by with, a food bag if we had a food delivery to a site, whatever creates that connection, and makes that like opportunity happen is key, because then you can see behind them to see the unit. And again, like Courtney said, property management is probably going to see the back of that unit more for folks that don't always let you in. And that's okay. That's a great opportunity to catch things if needed. We can jump in, offer more supports. Internal case conferencing. All the cases you see on here were part of case conferencing, I think, except one. And then, so having those regular check-ins to case conferencing and clinical perspective with internal and external, communication with case manager and PM team, IHSS worker assigned. So there was an IHSS worker to help maintain the cleanliness, do laundry, other things like that. Regularly scheduled treatment for bed bug and pests, so preventative measures that Courtney's team arranges with facilities that are phenomenal. Community as a whole watches out for him, like definitely that community connection across the board. But keep in mind, all that work up here under the actions executed can go just completely amiss unless you have the prevention piece and that communication piece, and you revisit him and you talk about him in case conferencing and do regular check-ins. Maybe it's less frequent, but you still have to check in and work and coordinate with providers. So anything you wanted to add to that case, Courtney?
No. Yeah. So if we can actually go to the next slide. So we wanted to present a case that actually turned out well, but then we also wanted to present a case that didn't go in the direction that we actually hoped it would. And so this case I was actually involved with. It happened at one of our latest lease ups. And unfortunately, we had a resident that continued to have a relationship with some individuals that she was homeless with. And so, and unfortunately, those individuals, they weren't trying to do the right thing. And so they actually pressured her into allowing them to come into the building, and she broke into the office. And so once we reviewed the cameras and we seen that she was actually involved with the situation, we got with the service provider. We held a meeting just to go over next steps. And then we actually called her in. And so the first thing that we actually engaged in was the motivational interview. And so this included the service team, the office team. And I would say one of the key points of the motivational interview is to definitely complete reflective listening. And so I led this. And it was just more of hearing her out and then just reiterating what she was saying, just to make sure we were both on the same page. From there, we documented the situation. She was very protective over the individuals. She didn't believe that they had actually completed the crime, even though she was there. It also came out that other residents had let her know that the individuals had also stole from her in the past. And unfortunately, she stated she didn't see them. So like the incident didn't happen. She doesn't believe that they're the ones who took the money. And so, her tie to the individuals was she wouldn't break it. And so unfortunately, when the question was posed to, if she would continue her relationship with the individual, she said yes, and she would continue to allow them to come onto the property. And so we actions executed were the motivational interview. We gave the option to move back to interim housing, just the established coordination pathways with external lead service provider and other organizations involved with the property. So we had the service provider. We also had Brilliant Corners involved. And so, yeah, this was one of the situations that we were a little unhappy with how things ended. And we definitely wanted to hear her out just to see if our perception of what happened actually was much different. Was, she, did they threaten her? Did anything of that sort happen? And she let us know no. So, so once she actually left, we brought up that she probably needs a change in location in order to be successful, just because she won't have such close access to these individuals. Definitely internal case conferencing, check-ins, meeting with her a lot more than what was taking place. Activities to complete during the day. This is something that she actually suggested that she thinks, would definitely benefit her. And relocation back to interim housing. So, I think in the property management world, and on the services side too, we want best case scenario because we want to keep them housed, but it's just sometimes they're not at the point to where they're ready for permanent housing. And so, and this was one of the cases. And so she did end up having to move. And guys, again, this is where it's great to have a relationship with your service provider, because sometimes instead of having to go eviction and legal route, they can actually just help you relocate her and in the lease. Okay. So next slide, or actually, yeah, I think we can go ahead and open it up to questions, guys.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think this has been the highest attendance that we've had in like the last year, with over 300 people coming to learn from you both. So that's fantastic. We have about 10-ish minutes. I'm going to try to go through. I've collected the questions and put them in categories. So hopefully we can hit some high level questions that folks in the Q&A box have placed. So for starters, going back to the on-site service provision. So are there any types of special service providers recommended to be housed on-site at any given time? And then if there are instances where off-site service providers are needed, are there any concerns with response times?
I can jump in on that one, and then Courtney can add from the PM perspective. But for this, we try to design a lot of the services on site. We just find that it's really more effective. However, like I said before, if you only have, let's say, 8 out of 100 units that are permanent supportive units, and that's contracted, let's say, behavioral health with the county, they're not going to be there full time for those 8 units. So just having realistic expectations and having staffing that can kind of be backup, like a residential service coordinator who's really trained and coordinate on the back end. But yeah, we definitely, like for our Cindy Cedro site, we have office space for Father Joe's. We have office space that other providers can use, like PACE or CRF. But it really is determined on what is the quantity in the building. And then they're not going to necessarily dedicate that full-time staff for 2 units, 8 units, things like that. But we definitely love the co-located model. It's way more effective. For those off-site, the VA has been really great about transporting folks to VA medical appointments or on-site VA like appointments at their locations. Other places we've seen within our portfolio, we've worked through bus passes. Some organizations provide bus passes. Sometimes some actually transport and pick up. So it really depends on the organization and things like that. But those are things to think about when you're in the development phase. Really, what can you get for the partnership that you have? Are you close to transit? all those things collectively, because it will impact how your operations function, which Courtney can definitely add.
Correct. So on the property management side, I'm going to be completely honest. We always want to have as much support as possible. And so it just comes down to what AJ said, more of when the deal is being structured, taking a look at the population. And a lot of times you want to structure the services to meet the needs of the population that you're actually going to be serving. So whether it's TAY, whether it's, veterans, that's what we just, we look for, is that the services that will be provided will actually be able to help that population. So you touched on everything, AJ.
Yeah, and then really fast, I just want to let everyone know that yes, the slide deck and the recording of the presentation will be sent to you all following this webinar. So going back to service provisions, one of the questions that we got is, what is the extent services can go to get people off drugs or into more extensive mental health treatments? And what about in situations where there are residents with medical complications? What resources should staff have in those situations?
So that happens across the board at our sites. Those are things we see a lot. I'm thinking right now of a senior site that we have for supportive housing. We see both. So working with agencies like PACE for medical needs, they actually have shuttles that can bring people to sites. We had an individual go through some medical complications, and they were able to coordinate care from the skilled nursing facility back to the site. And at times they have to go back to the skilled nursing facility if their wound care wasn't up to par, or other things like that. And that truly helps. The idea behind PACE, they can come on site, they can send like a CNA, an RN, kind of a mix of different levels of medical staff, and sometimes mental health or social work into that. And they can offer kind of just a review, like, are you taking your meds? How do you feel today? I know with CRF, they typically have a psych nurse on their team. So it's a behavioral health full service partnership ACT model team. And so they have a psych nurse that sometimes can go in the field and check their meds. They can check their blood pressure, things like that. But yeah, these cases come up all the time across the board, whether it's permanent supportive or not. The biggest thing, like Courtney was saying, at the development end, like the front end, to make sure you structure it right, for just general affordable, you have to know the resources. So that's where these trainings come into play. I saw someone in the chat that asked about domestic violence, really having your staff up to par, whether it be on domestic violence. Like NAMI, again, has a great mental health 101, great training. Medical training, who do you call for certain needs, really knowing your partners. So again, that communication piece that we both echoed, communicate, because you'll get to know who's your point person, who's your go-to for medical. Your local ambulance, you can do a non-emergency call, and sometimes that's ideal. They use it a lot with recuperative care. Working with local hospitals and their discharge teams, really having those clear relationships and taking the time and effort, which I know a lot of us don't have that, but kind of biting the bullet, drinking some coffee and getting it done, but developing that rapport in those relationships. Because even Courtney, with your team, building a relationship with the fire department or the police department. We've had sit downs with the police department talking about the rates of calls or things like that, just to get ahead of it.
And that's crucial, guys, because once you guys develop that relationship, and I know a lot of you guys do when you're going through the crime-free housing process, but just outside of that, just educating them on, your property and, what numbers to call in case of an emergency, the different type of emergencies, and also the PERT team. So having those relationships go so far. And sometimes they'll just call in to check in on you guys. I've had it happen at some properties. So build those relationships in your communities. I know sometimes if you have a property that cash flows very well, sometimes you can sustain to actually hire a full-time person out of the operations budget. So, every situation is going to be project specific, but definitely, work with your service provider, on looking for other options.
I wanted to add one thing, because I think I missed one item that was asked in the question. It was about drug treatment. So we work with the harm reduction model. Like Courtney said, it's actually in our documents to say we support harm reduction, housing first, all of that. So part of that is it's resident choice. So if the use bleeds out into the community, affects their tenancy, We work with the providers that intervene and do referrals. Like for instance, PACE has a direct relationship, whatever PACE, there's many different PACE, but most PACE programs have relationships with drug treatment programs, detox beds. We all know detox beds are far and very rare to catch, but when you can catch one, there could be an opportune moment to refer into them and they can coordinate that. Same with CRF and other programs. They're phenomenal with that. Even intervening on some cases with APS, they can also intervene with a multitude of different things, but that could be one of them. And thank you to whoever put in the chat. I can only see a little bit, but someone put a link for some places. I think it's in LA, LACDA. But there's a multitude of different resources. But the biggest thing is the professional development, making sure your team knows how that works, making sure you talk to your partnerships about how to access that or what does that look like if that's happening. So property management knows and we know.
Correct. And so AJ, I just want to add one last thing. Sorry, guys. Create your own network. So even though you guys work for different companies, don't be afraid to reach out to someone, at another company that, runs a PSH site and, ask them about, for tips, how are, things going at their site, what, resources they've used. And then that way you guys can really kind of piggyback off of each other. And that you actually will see just a huge success rate also.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I love Ayoko's plug in the chat for our SCAMP conference, where we have a workshop focused on this, which is housing-based care model, empowering residents to determine their own health, if you want to learn more. So one question that came up is, how do you address language and cultural differences when working with diverse populations?
So I'll take over that. So your property should have an LEP plan. And so for us, we actually have and utilize a translation service. And so that way we can make sure that we're able to communicate with any and everybody. Our sites actually have posters and little cards when you're completing your lease documents. And so you definitely maybe want to get with someone on your team and just go over what you guys have put into place. And then if you don't have anything to put in place, definitely you want to implement something just so you can make sure that you're able to communicate with everyone coming into the office.
And then from the services side, and actually everybody's side, facilities, property management, at our last training, we had our second boot camp of the year. I think it was last week. And we had DI training, implicit bias training, just self-reflection, how we assume things, even eye contact, physical gestures, how it could be perceived in different cultures, tone, anything like that, because we have different sites. We have like predominantly Chaldean sites, we have predominantly Persian site. We have like every race you could think of, every ethnicity you could think of across the board, across our sites. So really looking at who we're serving. And how we can meet the needs, because we definitely never want to exclude anybody. We want everybody to have full access. One of the things Courtney was mentioning, the posters, we actually developed a little symbol that didn't require any language. It was very clear. It was like an interpretation service. So thinking of different visuals, also thinking of ways that we could promote activities on site and service awareness on site in different languages. Google Translate's great. I know that Pixel Chrome earbuds actually can do translation in your ear, which is pretty fantastic. So we're actually looking into that. Obviously, once we see a higher need, but we can adapt some technology into that for like workshops, things like that, as well as for ADA needs, whether it be for hearing, having like the font at the bottom of the screen, or other things like that.
Great. So I want to switch gears to looking at more of that communication aspect that you've been mentioning this whole workshop. So what is the best way for residents to set up meetings with property managers? And how can resident service coordinators actually build relationships with folks in the buildings for those who are maybe more hesitant and not as open or welcoming to the resident service coordination staff? Those are kind of yeah, sorry.
So I'll hop in on the property management side. So just depending on the office setup, and I'm going to speak about our properties, the residents can actually reach our managers multiple ways. They can email them, they can call. We just recently started to implement Rent Cafe on our sites. You can actually reach our teams through there. So I would say that usually I would say for the fastest response, our residents just go into the office. All of our offices are back open. If the manager is not available at that time, usually it's just an appointment is set. And I would say it's great to have resident events. We definitely try to have as many as our budget allows. And so where we're getting everyone out, you're typically in an open setting, you're able to have conversations. Usually there's treats just depending on the resident event, but you guys, those events go so far, they go so far to where you actually start to build relationships with your residents even more than them coming in and, for their recertifications or just the initial move-in. So and it doesn't take a lot of money. Sometimes you can actually have, organizations near your property donate certain things. I know the grocery stores, sometimes they'll donate either a gift card or certain treats or food. So just kind of getting with your service provider, thinking outside the box, and it's definitely possible, but definitely making sure that you are accessible. So.
And then the latter half regarding more avoidant residents that are hard to engage. I mean, that happens everywhere. You get into your own safe space, you kind of want your own time. It does become an issue when you can't get them out of the unit to kind of talk with them, work with them. So really using motivational interviewing, like Courtney mentioned prior, finding out what their motivator is. I know in the past at a different project, we used coffee and donuts. We had coffee talk in the morning or donut chat. We had a catchy name. I don't remember the full name, but we had like really just fun, catchy things that even if they wanted to just come down and grab a donut and coffee and just maybe not even say hello, that was step one. Step two might be we'll drop off some resources or a bag of groceries at the door. But the team gets creative. They really get to know what each individual wants or doesn't want. And they are respectful of that. So just like any one of us, if someone came to my door with food, I would probably open it. They came to my door with paperwork, I probably would not open it. So, it's kind of like, what does the person, prefer? What do you think would actually work? But it's using your service provider's best judgment when it comes to that and how they know the resident.
And then also just kind of going back on the PM side, if you do have that resident that you can't get out, hard to communicate, I would definitely say, again, get the case manager involved. And so it's a familiar face that they trust. Sometimes it's us standing with them at the door and communicating through the door. And as the relationship progresses and they see you more and you start to build that trust with them, next thing you know, they're at your office first thing Monday morning, letting you know how their weekend went. So it's just about the trust, the deliverance, and also, guys, just really big on tone. Because that's been one of the things that we've heard complaints about, just having a good tone when you're speaking with the residents. That way you can build that trust.
You just made me think of one other thing. Peer support specialists. Peer support specialists are phenomenal. Honestly, we've used them as bridges, like for conversations, interventions, especially at our cathedral property. But they know what the experience is like. They have a personal connection. They can relate in a way that maybe the service provider, the clinical side, maybe that person cannot. So oftentimes they can build that rapport and that relationship, and they can be that kind of bridge back to Courtney, like Courtney was saying with the service provider. But those peer support specialists are so important, or hiring staff at whatever level that have lived experience, because it's definitely so important to have that perspective, to understand it in a different way, in a more personal way, that no one else can understand.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. That was actually the last question I was going to ask you, because it was asked a few times, is do you hire folks with lived experience? We're a little bit over time, and I just want, and there's so many great questions in the chat. I just wanted to thank you on behalf of SCAMP. This was so informative. We will send out the slide deck and the recording of the presentation to everyone, as well as if there's any questions, I'm sure that folks still have, they can reach out to the two of you and use as a resource, if that's okay. Really, thanks everyone for a fantastic webinar. Really, really great.
Thank
Thanks
you
for having us.
guys.
Bye, guys.